Good afternoon. The first item of business is portfolio questions this is on environment, climate change and land reform. Question number 1, Murdo Fraser, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it plans to introduce a deposit return scheme for drinks containers.
Cabinet Secretary.
We continue to make progress with implementing our ambitious deposit return scheme as part of our response to the global climate emergency. We want a scheme that is high-performing from day one and are working with industry to understand and test the timeline for implementation. We will also take account of feedback received from the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, which continues to consider the draft legislation to establish the scheme. Our agreed go-live date will be included in the final version of those regulations, which will be laid before Parliament in the new year.
Murdo Fraser.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her response? I know there's a great deal of support in principle for the idea of a deposit return scheme, but there are serious concerns in the packaging and supply sectors that having a scheme in Scotland which is distinct from a scheme that might apply elsewhere in the UK will add costs and cause difficulties in the supply chain. And I wonder why the Scottish Government are not considering delaying their scheme to ensure that any scheme introduced in Scotland is similar to a scheme introduced elsewhere in the UK, given the UK Government has indicated they intend to bring such a scheme forward.
Cabinet Secretary.
The UK Government does intend to bring a scheme forward, and I'm really pleased to note that the UK Tory manifesto includes a scheme that would include glass. However, there's no timescales for that scheme, and the Scottish Government is well further forward in terms of its arrangements, and in those circumstances, and given that this is an entirely devolved area of policy, I think it's entirely reasonable for the Scottish Government to continue to do the work that it is doing. I very much hope that the work that we are doing will help inform the UK Government's own progress towards an effective deposit return scheme for the whole of the UK.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, President Officer. The Cabinet Secretary has mentioned at committee many times the Implementation Advisory Group. Can she expand on what involvement the group will have and whether retailers will be able to input to the group to assist with the implementation of the scheme?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Implementation Advisory Group was set up to work closely with government officials on the operational aspects of the proposed scheme, and it includes representatives already from all sectors which will have ultimate responsibility for the day-to-day operation of the deposit return scheme. And this group has now itself created a series of working groups which are exploring practical features of the scheme, such as the operation of return points and a potential level for the handling fee to be paid to retailers. And they're working very closely with Zero Waste Scotland as well on a number of those detailed aspects, which at the end of the day are best brought into being by the sector itself.
Question 2 is not lodged. Question 3, Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what its response is to Oil and Gas UK's Environment Report 2018, which highlights a commitment to playing its part in building a sustainable industry that is progressively lowering its emission intensity.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I welcome the industry's commitment to lowering its offshore emission intensity, and we're committed to achieving a net zero emissions economy and managing this fairly. North Sea production is highly regulated, with some of the most advanced and comparatively least polluting production methods in the world. Maintaining domestic oil and gas production can lead to lower net global emissions. We're supportive of the sector's plans to decarbonise oil and gas production itself, as well as to engage the sector in embracing and leading deployment of technologies such as floating offshore wind, hydrogen production and carbon capture, utilisation and storage.
Liam Kerr.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Statistics published by the Government this September state that last year 82% of all UK oil and gas was produced in Scotland and that production increased by 4.6%. Now, with Scotland employing 39% of the oil and gas industry in the UK and the North East being a focal point for that activity, will the Cabinet Secretary rule out supporting any proposals for a windfall tax that would risk 26,000 jobs in Aberdeen alone and potentially reverse the good work on emissions that the Cabinet Secretary talked about?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm not sure, frankly, that it is within my remit to be talking about any tax in this regard, and I'm sure that proposals for taxes are being looked at very carefully across the board. But as the member knows, there is no devolved ability for us to do any such thing in Scotland yet. So at the moment, his question is somewhat premature.
Supplementary is Claudia Beamish, followed by Patrick Harver, followed by Maureen Watt. Ms Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following on from Offshore Europe's conference in September, where the oil and gas industry set out its roadmap to a more sustainable future, can the Cabinet Secretary tell us whether, and if so, how the Scottish Government might be able to advise, monitor and assess the progress of the industry as it shifts towards net zero and how it's doing it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we have a constant dialogue with the industry. Clearly, it's a key industry in Scotland, and we want to ensure that the industry is able to continue to operate as effectively in terms of reducing its emissions from production. As the member knows, there are two aspects to oil and gas, the consumption side and the production side. And the production side, I know that industries are working very hard to get their carbon emissions down as quickly as possible. And they are focused on working towards net zero in terms of production. And we will continue to work directly with them in that regard. It is important because it is a very key industry, and there are a number of aspects about the industry which for Scotland go beyond simply what the member has asked. As she is aware, there's a just transition issue when we talk about oil and gas in Scotland, so we have to handle this whole industry very carefully, and the dialogue is constant.
Patrick Harvey.
This measure of carbon intensity tells us nothing at all about the actual impact of the fossil fuel industry and the materials that it extracts from the ground. If we're in a climate emergency, we need a bit more robust of a response than this thin greenwash of talking about net zero when you're talking about carbon extraction. Does the Cabinet Secretary recognise that globally over 5% of the world's GDP is spent on fossil fuel subsidies? And when will the Scottish Government recognise that we need to be redirecting that vast flow of money into the transition that's needed rather than keeping business as usual for the lethal fossil fuel industry?
Thank you, Cabinet
Well,
Secretary.
I don't think there's anything going on that might be regarded as business as usual. The industry itself is working very hard to reduce its own emissions. We're very much aware that there will be a continued role for oil and gas until we are able to move consumption away completely from fossil fuels. Any suggestion that one can switch away from that consumption before there is the ability to make that handover, it does not understand the massive disruption that would take place in those circumstances and the likelihood of importing from other countries whose industries are not decarbonising in the way oil and gas in the North Sea is. So, you know, this is a complicated and complex issue, which it continues to be one that we address as carefully as possible. But if the members saw the evidence that both Chris Stark from the Climate Change Committee gave to the committee and David Joff, he will understand that it is far more complicated than he makes out.
Maureen Watt.
Would the Cabinet Secretary agree that by ring-fencing the current tax revenues from oil and gas and investing in a just transition, we can support long-term investments in tackling the climate crisis and deliver benefits to communities and to our environment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, most of us here in this chamber do accept that the oil and gas sector is a key component of our economy and does remain integral to a sustainable, secure and inclusive energy transition. The Office for Budget Responsibility estimate that the North Sea will generate further revenues of £8.5 billion over the next 5 years. Ring-fencing these revenues into a net zero fund would indeed unlock significant additional investment in efforts to decarbonise the economy and would also help deliver a just transition for areas like Aberdeen and the North East that currently rely heavily on the oil and gas sector for employment.
Question 4, Mike Rumble.
To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with stakeholders, including the Scottish SPCA, regarding reforming its animal welfare legislation.
Minister Mary Goujon.
The Scottish Government holds regular meetings with stakeholders on a range of animal welfare issues, and it's this continuous engagement and discussion which has helped inform our current bill on animal welfare and wildlife.
Mike Rumbles.
Well, we all know that unlike domestic or wild animals, the welfare of farm animals comes under the responsibility of the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy because there are commercial considerations. Surely the welfare of all animals should be our concern, regardless of commercial considerations, and isn't it time for the welfare of all animals to be taken together into one government portfolio? Isn't the welfare of all animals equal?
I don't know if that's a proper question for the Minister, really.
So why isn't it
no, I'm just asking the Minister what...
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy to take
certainly.
I mean, that's the thing. I would just say in response to that, that I mean, I certainly deal with all issues relating to whether they're domestic animals, farmed animals or wild animals in Scotland when it relates to animal health and welfare. And it's a responsibility which, of course, I take absolutely seriously, like I say, regardless of which category those animals fall into. But if the member wants to write to me on this point for further information, I'd be quite happy to respond to him.
Beg your pardon. I have Mark Ruskell, followed by Alistair Allen. Mr Ruskell, if you can have them briefly, please.
The Minister will be as bitterly disappointed as I am that the Special Constable's pilot in the Cairngorms has really failed to detect any wildlife crime whatsoever over the last 2 years. Does the Minister believe, like I do, that it's absolutely the right time now to match the existing powers that the SSPCA have in relation to domestic animals with new powers in relation to wild animals so they can get on with the job and actually properly detect the disgusting wildlife crime that we see in Scotland?
Minister.
I think it's only fair to say that, I mean, we had to undertake that as a pilot to see if this is, if that was going to be a system that would work. And I know that there's a review currently underway in relation to that as well. But in relation to the point about the SSPCA, I mean, this is a conversation that I haven't had with them, and it's an issue that hasn't been raised with me at all. So it isn't something that we have considered either as part of the legislation that we have coming forward at the moment.
Alistair Allen.
Given what the Minister has just said, can she advise what progress is being made in establishing the Animal Welfare Commission?
Minister.
I'm happy to update the Chamber on that. On the 24th of September, we announced Professor Cathy Dwyer had been appointed as the chair of the new Scottish Animal Welfare Commission. And I'm absolutely delighted that Professor Dwyer accepted that role, given the wealth of experience that she has. And now, with the chair appointed, recruitment of members to serve on the commission is well underway. And I would fully anticipate that the commission will be up and running early in the new year.
Question 5, Emma Harper.
To ask the Scottish Government what information it has regarding the levels of illegal puppy trafficking through the port of Cairnryan and how much revenue has been recovered by HMRC from this.
Minister.
The extent of puppy trafficking through Cairnryan is difficult to accurately determine, given that it is a hidden and illegal activity. The Scottish SPCA advised, however, that the number of puppies seized this year by their Special Investigations Unit is 60, and these seizures are attributed to Operation Delphin, which is a multi-agency task force set up to target the illegal puppy trade. The Scottish Government doesn't hold information on the revenue recovered by HMRC from individuals involved in the illegal trafficking of puppies, but we know that they take an active interest in this area, and we continue to work with them and other enforcement bodies through the Puppy Trade Working Group.
Emma Harper.
I thank the Minister for that response. I understand that puppy trafficking through the port of Cairnryan is on the rise, with many seizures of both puppies and large amounts of cash. Given that the HMRC currently won't release information on how much cash is seized, can the Minister outline how a fair share of this money might come to Scotland?
Minister.
I think, as I understand it, HMRC's primary interest is in the recovery of unpaid tax from those who are operating as unlicensed puppy dealers, and I'm not aware of they themselves seizing large amounts of cash at Cairnryan linked to puppy trafficking. However, I'll be happy to engage with them on this issue through the Puppy Trade Working Group. In Scotland, cash can be seized either as a production in a predicate criminal case, for example, as an available asset in confiscation proceedings, or under Part 5 of the Proceeds of Crime Act as part of a civil recovery investigation. And if in due course the cash is included as part of a confiscation order or it's forfeited by the court, it will be remitted to the Scottish Consolidated Fund.
Question 6 not lodged. Question 7, Keith Brown.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to ensure that schemes to help improve the environment are given long-term certainty over their future.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, obviously, many of our environmental schemes are supported and funded by the EU, such as LIFE, the Common Agricultural Policy and structural funds. And I am deeply concerned about the loss of EU funding on the delivery of environmental outcomes. I have continually pressed the UK Government to provide clarity on future funding arrangements, but in the absence of that clarity, the Scottish Government has published its own consultation on the replacement for the EU structural funds to give stakeholders the opportunity to bring their experience and expertise to the development of any successor arrangements.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer and ask whether she agrees with me, given what she's just said, about the contrast between the actions of her government and that of the UK Government, which has for far too long been limited by an embarrassing lack of ambition, not least in the recently produced manifesto commitments, which will do nothing to tackle rising global temperatures, described by the recent UN climate report as devastating. So would the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that there is now no more time to waste? Westminster must follow Scotland's lead and get its act together on green energy.
Well, Scotland is, in fact, leading the way on its approach to addressing climate change, not just in the UK, but globally. And we continue to press the UK Government on its failure to match its rhetoric with practical actions around renewable energy to support our climate response and match our net zero ambition. And some of that goes to the earlier discussion we were having about moving away from oil and gas. It was disappointing that in their manifesto they have failed to do so, but we are very clear that we will continue to lead for the UK on this crucial issue of our times and allow other parties to trail in our wake.
Question 8, Jenny Mara.
Trailing in her wake, to ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the recommendations in the Scottish Environment Link report, Environmental Governance, Effective Approaches for Scotland post-Brexit.
Cabinet Secretary.
The best way to continue to protect our environment is, of course, to remain in the EU in the first place. However, I'm taking forward the development of new arrangements in a careful, systematic way based on our best assessment of likely gaps. In October, I announced plans for an interim panel to provide for assurance in this area should the UK leave with no deal in place. The report published by Scottish Environment Link is a valuable contribution to the development of longer-term arrangements, and I'm considering the recommendations in this report alongside the results of the Government's own consultation held earlier this year.
Jenny Mara.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer. She has acknowledged before the concerns regarding the impact of Brexit on environmental protections. Given that this is a devolved matter, it should be possible with sensible planning and forethought to mitigate the worst aspects of Brexit in this area. The report makes clear that ideally new governance structures would include an independent parliamentary commissioner and a dedicated environment court. Neither of these will be put in place quickly, so can the Cabinet Secretary tell us if she is planning to create these bodies, and if so, what work is underway to bring them into being?
Well, as I indicated in my initial answer, we are looking very carefully at the long-term arrangements that would be required. The establishment, for example, of an environmental court goes far beyond our immediate concerns of the immediate mitigation of the impacts of Brexit, which is why we've had to divert some of our resources to the business of setting up an interim arrangement should we be out in short order. There would need to be some degree of very careful thought as well as further consultation to go as far as some of the proposals in the Scottish Environment Link report, which would require primary legislation. So are things that we need to look at in the longer term. But these are currently matters that are very much in discussion and consideration. And at the moment, we're not ruling anything out. And at the moment, we do have an interim panel ready to go, literally overnight, should it be necessary.
Shona Robertson.
Does the Cabinet Secretary share my concern at the Tories' plan to create an Office for Environmental Protection with apparent UK-wide remit over devolved matters like climate change?
Cabinet Secretary.
While the UK Government's proposals for an Office for Environmental Protection fell with their Environment Bill when Parliament was dissolved, the Tories have committed in their manifesto to establish this, and in fact, at no notice, it was expanded to include issues to do with climate change. And it is unclear the extent of the powers that they, at the moment, seek to draw into this. This government will not accept any attempt to pull devolved powers over climate change or indeed air quality or water quality into the remit of this office. However, we do need the UK government to step up to the plate and act on the matters it is responsible for to help Scotland reach net zero by 2045, which is something the UK Committee on Climate Change was very clear was going to be necessary if we were to achieve our targets. Thank you. That concludes questions on environment, climate change and land reform. We move on to the next set of questions. And these are on the rural economy. Question 1, Colin Beattie, please.
To ask the Scottish Government what progress it is making with plant passporting.
Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing.
The plant passporting regime will change on 14th December as Scotland keeps pace with the EU by bringing into force the EU's Smarter Rules for Safer Food legislative package. The biggest change will be in the timber sector, involving new procedures for the movement of conifer timber with bark. It is vitally important that implementation is proportionate and agreed with the sector. Following conversations I had with ministers at DEFRA earlier this year, the Scottish and UK governments have been working closely with the sector to ensure a new system is in place by the deadline.
Colin Beattie.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise on what the consequences for Scottish businesses will be if the application deadline is missed, and what the Scottish Government can do to support Scottish businesses to achieve that deadline on 14th December?
Cabinet Secretary.
The sector fear that the consequences of missing the deadline, of failing to provide a solution, could be very serious indeed. It's difficult to quantify, but we are talking of potentially very, very large costs indeed. That's why I've been pressing the UK for some considerable time to agree a new system to deal with this, and it was unfortunate that a technical meeting that had been planned for stakeholders to attend on 25th November was unilaterally cancelled by the UK government. I intervened at that point to ask why, since Purdah did not appear to be applicable, and I'm pleased to say that probably as a result the meeting has been reinstated for tomorrow, the 5th of December. However, that leaves very little time to put in place a system by the deadline, as Mr Beattie knows, and therefore, if that is the case, there has to be a period of grace to allow the industry to implement the new arrangements. Otherwise, the consequences for the sector could be very serious indeed, at a time when the sawmill sector is experiencing considerable pressure.
Question 2, Adam Tompkin.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the support it's providing to the food and drink industry.
Cabinet Secretary.
We continue to work with farmers, food producers and industry bodies to drive forward the Ambition 2030 food and drink strategy. Our programme for government sets out a range of new measures to support the sector, building on the work already ongoing. Indeed, direct investment and support to the food and drink sector in Scotland, Presiding Officer, from the public sector across a range of areas, including skills, education, research, industry development, standards and capital investment, equates to approximately £100 million per annum.
Adam Tompkins.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I understand that one of the measures shortly to be introduced will restrict retailers' promotional activity and marketing of so-called discretionary foods, including confectionery, sweet biscuits and cakes. Now, at least one retailer has raised concerns with me about the implications of these restrictions for the Scottish Government's stated ambitions for growth in the food and drink sector. So what assurances can the Minister provide to Scottish businesses who are likely to be impacted by such measures?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, these are matters, as the member should know, I think, that is not within my portfolio, but falls within the portfolio of the Minister for Public Health, Mr Fitzpatrick. He and I work closely on these matters, and I know that he is aware of the concerns that industry may have in relation to any such measures. And part of my task is to ensure that we continue to work collaboratively together prior to consideration of whether any such matters should be included to be taken forward.
Emma Harper.
Does the Cabinet Secretary share my concerns at the details which emerged from the Department of Trade documents that suggest that the Tories are prepared to ditch Scotland's valuable PGIs, which I've highlighted since 2016, and that even in the very early stages, the US is pressuring the UK pressuring for UK autonomy from EU food and health standards?
Cabinet Secretary.
Extremely important matters. The PGIs, the Scotch beef, Scotch lamb, Scotch whisky, they're vital to the promotion of Scottish high-quality produce, and they help to cement a premium upon such products, which helps the profitability and success of the sector. Presiding Officer, over the past 2 years, myself, Ms Canny and Ms Goujon have repeatedly put our representations to Mr Gove and others on these matters at the UK Government. And even now, after a couple of years' work and constant representation about the importance of these matters, we haven't made any progress with the detail. Sadly, the UK is just fixated on Brexit, and now we are worried also that the trade deal with the USA may further compromise the standards of our agricultural produce. Such a proposal is utterly unacceptable to the Scottish Government.
Question 3, Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it's taking to ensure the welfare of farmed animals.
Minister.
Keepers must meet animals' welfare needs under the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006. The Scottish Government introduced the Animals and Wildlife Bill to amend that Act, increasing available penalties for cruelty offences and introducing a new procedure to allow animals, including farm animals, taken into possession by enforcement authorities to be sold on or rehomed swiftly without the need for a court order. We are replacing the codes of practice of the welfare of livestock with guidance encouraging best practice above the minimum legislative requirements, and are committed to introducing compulsory CCTV into Scottish abattoirs.
Ruth Maguire.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Earlier this year, the Scottish Government did give a commitment to ensure mandatory CCTV recording in all areas of slaughterhouses where live animals are present to aid those enforcing animal legislation. I wonder, could the Minister give an update on that work, please?
Minister.
The member is, of course, right, because that was part of our PFG commitments this year. But I would add that at present, the welfare of animals at slaughter is ensured by staff from the Food Standards Scotland Agency, and over 99% of animals slaughtered in Scotland are monitored by some configuration of CCTV coverage. And again, the PFG this year commits the Scottish Government to bringing forward secondary legislation to make CCTV recording of slaughter compulsory in Scottish slaughterhouses, and to support the industry to introduce CCTV before it becomes compulsory.
Question 4 is withdrawn. Question 5, Alison Johnson.
To ask the Scottish Government what steps it will take to reduce gear conflict in Scotland's fisheries.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government works closely with industry to facilitate better interaction among everyone using Scotland's marine environment, including fishers. Our network of regional inshore fisheries groups who take a collaborative and stakeholder-focused approach to improving the management of our inshore fisheries are exploring solutions to improve sector harmony and thus reduce the risk of gear conflict. This work builds on the recommendations from the Gear Conflict Task Force, including temporal and spatial separation methods and improvements to visibility and identification of static gear, which we will legislate for in due course.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the work of the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation, who tell us that the removal of the 3-mile limit has proven to be an unmitigated environmental and economic disaster of epic proportions. I appreciate that the Cabinet Secretary's response, but given that 85% of gear conflict takes place within 3 miles of land, can the Cabinet Secretary advise when he expects a conclusion to the work that's currently taking place?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I am aware of the importance of the work that members of the Scottish Creel Federation do, as I am aware of the importance of the work that is carried out by all fishers across all sectors. And I think it's important to avoid any misrepresentation of the position, Presiding Officer, because gear conflict is not something that is occurring in the majority of fishing trips and occasions. It's a relatively isolated instance. It's not so widespread as such a question may infer, nor do we think that arbitrary limits are the way to proceed. Spatial management and other methods of management are very helpful and appropriate. The regional inshore fisheries groups have been very successful. The North East Group in particular has engaged with industry reps to explore solutions to improve sector harmony. And in addition to that, the programme to equip the scallop dredge sector with remote electronic monitoring systems will in itself provide perhaps one of the most significant steps forward in resolution of the differing interests between differing fisheries sectors. So we're working hard across the board on a number of matters in this area, and we are happy to continue to work with all stakeholders and MSBs on this matter.
The supplementary is Peter Chapman, followed by Claudia Beamish. Mr. Chapman.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Surely the Cabinet Secretary must realise there is also gear conflict between EU boats and Scottish boats, especially around Shetland, and that the only practical way to reduce that gear conflict is to come out of the EU, out of the CFP, and take back control of our waters.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, no, I don't actually, and I think if you... Well, I don't actually. I noticed today in the Press and Journal a leading member of the fishing community has come out and said that that's precisely what would be against the interests of the Scottish fishing sector. Go and read your newspaper, Mr. Chapman, and you will see that fishermen are turning away from Brexit and the glib and over-exaggerated promises that have bored us for far too long. And moreover, what our fishermen are concerned about is equivalence, that any measures imposed on them must also be applied to all other fishing vessels across all nations. That's a factual matter, but then again, we don't really hear very much about factual matters from the Scottish Conservatives.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I understand in relation to GPS that on fishing vessels for conflict resolution, compliance and, of course, research, that is already committed to by the Scottish Government. However, is the Scottish Government intending to create a clear definition of fishing vessels, which could include exemptions for very small vessels, such as rowing boats with a few creels? And that would be helpful, indeed, to this party in making a decision about support for all vessels.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm sorry, the Conservatives' audible displeasure at my last answer meant I didn't hear the first part of Ms Beamish's question, Presiding Officer. I wasn't sure exactly from what exemption is being sought, but can I assure the member that I'm very happy to read back her question and to give her a full answer in writing, and I'll extend the courtesy of her doing so and will consider it sympathetically.
Question 6, Angus MacDonald.
I ask the Scottish Government whether the Rural Economy Secretary's offer to lead the end-year fisheries negotiations in Brussels has been accepted by the UK Government.
Cabinet Secretary.
I wrote to the Secretary of State on 22nd November extending my offer for Scotland to lead the upcoming fisheries negotiations with myself as lead minister, working on behalf of the whole of the UK. I'm still waiting a response. However, I hope my suggested approach is considered, Presiding Officer, as it was intended, as my striving to take a constructive approach that will give welcome certainty and clarity in these uncertain times for the UK Government. And I believe accepting my offer would reap the greatest benefits possible for the whole UK.
Angus MacDonald.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his reply, and it's certainly disappointing that he hasn't received a reply to date. It seems to me, and I'm sure every fair-minded person in this chamber, that by allowing Scotland to lead the negotiations on behalf of the UK, full preparations can be made away from the post-election turmoil in London. The UK Government's already made clear that access to Scottish waters will be on the table in future trade talks with the EU before these crucial annual EU negotiations take place. And we know that the UK will have to abide by common fisheries policy rules during the transition period. So if Scotland has to leave the EU with the UK on the 31st of January, how quickly does the Cabinet Secretary think the great betrayal of Scottish fishing will begin?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think we all share and harbour concerns that the promises made by the UK Government over the past 3 years have been glib, have been boastful and have really lacked any substance, not least because the withdrawal agreement and the associated documents do not contain any agreement on fishing whatsoever. It was too difficult for them to do that because they wouldn't have got the deal that they boasted they could get. It was too hard. So instead, The documents on the table, which are being presented as a panacea for all the ills of Scottish fishing, are simply an agreement to kick the can down the road, an agreement to seek an agreement at a later time, not worth the paper it's written on. No contract, no certainty, no clarity, no future, no hope. I suspect the betrayal will begin shortly after the voting is finished.
Question 7, Michelle Ballantyne.
No, oh, that's it. To ask the Scottish Government how many applications from rural areas to the Community Asset Transfer Scheme have been refused following an appeal in the last 3 years.
Cabinet Secretary.
Since Forestry and Land Scotland opened the Community Asset Transfer Scheme in January 2017, 15 requests have been received in total, all in rural areas. Of these, 11 have been approved, 3 are awaiting decision and 1 has been refused. A total of 73 asset transfer requests has been approved by relevant authorities across Scotland by 31st March this year.
Michelle Ballantyne.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. Recently, and I presume this is the one, a community asset transfer application submitted by the Ettrick and Yarrow Community Development Company for the transfer of Gamesclew Forest and the Ettrick Marshes was refused on appeal, despite the fact that an independent panel report commissioned by Scottish ministers following the appeal recommended that the transfer should take place. I would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary what justification is required for the Cabinet Secretary to choose to not act on the recommendations of an independent panel following a community asset transfer appeal.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I should perhaps start by gently correcting the member that the decision was taken by my colleague Gillian Campbell. It's not mine to make, it's within her portfolio. But in response to the question, and being generous as I am in answering a question that's really directed towards another Cabinet Secretary, could I say that the independent panel brought a wide-ranging understanding of land ownership and the responsibility that entails, and Scottish ministers took the recommendations into account alongside other available information, and although the request was refused, recognised the community's aspiration to improve their community, and that's why, Presiding Officer, the ministers have asked Professor Russell Griggs, OBE, Chair of South of Scotland Economic Partnership, to work with the community and Forest and Land Scotland to help identify alternative options with support from the Community Ownership Support Service.
Question 8, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it's taking to ensure farmers are supported to operate in an environmentally sustainable way.
Minister.
Environmental sustainability is of key concern to the Scottish Government, and we continue to support our farmers and crofters through both direct payments and the Scottish Rural Development Programme. In Scotland, we've taken an ambitious approach to actions and schemes such as greening, agri-environment and climate, and the Farm Advisory Service. And in addition to these, we have and continue to support initiatives such as our flagship Farming for a Better Climate and industry-led programmes like the QMS AHDB Monitor Farm Network in order to support and promote environmental sustainability.
Brian Whittle.
Could I thank the Minister for her response? I wonder if she agrees with me that the current broad brush condemnation of red meat production does not recognise the vast difference between Scotland's predominantly grass-fed red meat production system compared to the intensive feed system that much of the Americas and Asia partake in, and we should be supporting our farmers in their continued drive for more sustainable, environmentally friendly food production.
Minister.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more with that, and I believe the member will be referring to the programme that aired last week, where there was a little, if any, probably just the throwaway references to how we farm in the UK. It did no justice whatsoever. It didn't really draw clearly enough the parallels between how the systems are so intrinsically different, and the way we farm here in Scotland is completely different to other parts of the world, where we have some of the highest animal health and welfare standards, and that's something we need to shout about and get that message spread, that what we do here and what we produce here is the best anywhere in the world.
Richard Lyle.
Officer, does the Minister share my concern if the Tories win this UK election and we are forced to Brexit, our current high level of environmental standards which protect plant, tree health and animal welfare will be driven down and abandoned in a race to the bottom to win dodgy trade deals?
Minister.
I do see that concern. I mean, especially in light of my previous answer there, where I talk about us having some of the best animal health and welfare standards anywhere in the world. And we are absolutely determined and committed to maintaining those. And that is why the Scottish Government is absolutely adamant that future trade deals cannot undercut the high agricultural and environmental standards that we proudly hold here in Scotland. Sustainability and inclusion has to lie at the core of our future trade policy, and we have to take a robust approach to monitoring these considerations at all stages of the negotiation and implementation processes.
Thank you. That concludes questions on rural economy. And we have a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.